Hello and welcome. The wrecks of Scapa Flow have brought people from all over the world to Orkney to dive down to the seabed, to explore them, and also to study them in detail, to learn more about the ships and their stories. One of the most active people in the study of the wrecks is Emily Turton. She's a diver and a dive boat skipper, and she can usually be found aboard her purpose-built dive boat, the MV Huskian. She's also a fellow of the Explorers Club, and for the past 18 years, she has dedicated her time to the exploration of the wrecks of Scapa Flow, and in recent years, to a series of initiatives marking anniversaries of events in and around the flow. She was the driving force behind the Scapa 100 initiative, a project set up to commemorate the scuttling of the German High Seas Fleet after World War I. She co-organised the HMS Hampshire 100 survey. She organised the HMS Vanguard 100 survey in 2016-2017 and the HMS Royal Oak 80 survey in 2018-2019. In her survey and project work, she collaborates with a wide range of people and institutions, building expert teams of like-minded individuals. It's a life of much activity on the sea and deep below its surface. And if you had asked her in her school days as to whether she anticipated it would turn out like this, she would have found it difficult to believe. And she's with us now and going to tell the story. So, Emily, welcome. And back in your school days, you lived quite far from the sea.
I did. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. Yes, I grew up in a little West Yorkshire town called Howie Firth. And for those slightly older people watching would recognise that as where the TV series Last of the Summer Wine was filmed. But maybe not for some of the younger people. It's not been on telly for a while. Never ever thought I would end up living by the sea and working on the sea. But here I am, and it's the only place that's really ever felt like home.
And when you were thinking about study and work and career, going to university, for instance, it definitely wasn't anything to do with boats or navigation or the sea that you were studying.
No, it was music, all music. I avoided sport at all costs, hid in the music block at school, and it was brass banding. I grew up in a West Yorkshire town. I played a brass instrument, and then singing took over, and I went to university to study performing arts, music and singing.
So if events had taken a different track, you could be following a singing career.
Well, that was what I was doing. I was young, but it's really all my dad's fault that I'm in Orkney, he's not with us anymore, but he took us on holiday in 2003 to Cyprus, and I had to choose between going on holiday with him, and he booked it and he was desperate to go and he wasn't a very well man, or taking a big audition. And I missed the audition and went on the holiday, which I'm glad I did because it was my last chance to go away with my father before he died. But I was bored and this, sulking, so I'd missed an audition to be there in this strange little place in Cyprus. So I tried scuba diving, and that was that, really. I got back to the UK. I'd shot myself in the foot with an audition. I wasn't important enough in the music world to have been able for them to rearrange it for me. So I thought, well, I'm somewhere cold. My mum lives by the sea. She was already up in Orkney. There must be some diving there. I'd got a handful of dives, literally completely inexperienced. I thought I'll go and see what Orkney's about. I had no idea about Scapa Flow. I just thought she lives by the sea. There must be some diving. And that was it. I came here and I haven't gone home yet.
And how did the involvement with the wrecks first start? That would just be through diving in the flow?
Yes, I came as a diving tourist, very inexperienced, used the local dive centre here that was Scapa Scuba, got some extra training, and then just, I think it was the first time I'd ever done anything really practical. And I've got this chunk of time, so I immersed myself, so excuse the pun, in something completely new. And just did a course after course after course, and then thought, I like this, I'll maybe stay here for a while. I never really intended to stay this long, but yeah, I suppose that's it now. I'm here.
Now, how did the next stage follow that you went into the diving business, skippering a boat, for instance?
Yeah, so I loved the diving myself. I then did some courses that allowed me to be a dive guide. And while I really enjoyed showing people the wrecks, I didn't like so much being completely responsible for them underwater. So the next challenge was to learn how to drive a boat. And so I did that. It was sort of something really practical outside my comfort zone. And then I thought it'd be a really good idea to buy into a dive charter business. So I bought half into our older boat, previous boat, which was she's been here a long time. It was the Radiant Queen. So I bought in there, and that was my first season as a charter business owner was then 2006. So I'd worked on the boats for a few years, and then that was it. 2006, I really learned how much of a noose around your neck a boat is. An obsession, but once I was in, we were in. And I loved it. I just loved getting better at doing something practical, at being in charge of something, at being responsible for something, and then developing the techniques to help divers explore the wrecks, rather than just be that taxi service that takes them over a wreck and throws them in and picks them back up and shoves a cup of tea in their hand. I wanted to find a way of helping them really understand what's there and discover it. And that was initially showing them pictures or drawing them little line drawings on whiteboards. And then by really researching the history, you could bring the whole reason the ships were there alive more, and then taking more underwater pictures. And then I found all these people that were making 3D imagery of wrecks and combine it all together. And you can really help somebody that either isn't a diver or that is a diver just trying to, in 1 week, really get the most out of the wrecks that are here. It really helps them to understand what's underwater. It's just become an obsession now.
I was wondering now about the attraction, because people are coming to Orkney from all over the world. It's costly, it takes a lot of time. It must be something very special when they get into the water and dive down to one of those wrecks.
The German fleet is just unique, and it's accessible. So we have lots of shipwrecks in Orkney. The main visitor attraction is the remains of the scuttled German fleet. So it's a point in history that era of shipping, the biggest collection of those ships that are accessible to people is here, full stop. Most of the ships of that era were scrapped, or, yes, we've got a big collection of ships at Jutland, but it's not an accessible part of the world to get to easily. So I think for a wreck diver, Scapa Flow is on that list of top wreck diving destinations in the world. But it's cold water, so we attract a certain type of person. It's not warm water, it's cold water diving. You need far more thermal protection, and the visibility isn't crystal clear. The wrecks are huge, 175 meters long, the longest German ship we have, but you get 10 meters visibility on average, maybe on a very, very good day 20. So you can never see all of the ship at once. They unfold a piece at a time. So I think the divers that love this type of diving like the mystery, and it's a bit spooky down there in some ways, not in a graveyard type of way. We're not diving on the German fleet on places where people died, but just like walking around an old building at twilight, you can only see so much at a time, and so it's a big journey of discovery, each wreck. So they just fascinated me. I loved it.
And did you find over time that the story of all the different elements of the fleet itself and the scuttling, that things about the story of the people and the events, that kind of attracted you?
Absolutely. And I've been throwing little bits of that, little anecdotes and nuggets of stories into our dive briefings, the stories we tell our divers to help them find their way around. But the biggest piece of work we've done that really, really got us fully immersed, I've used that word again, but in that story, the German fleet story, was working towards the centenary events. So in 2019, it was a huge year. We had the centenary of the scuttling of the German fleet. And just people from all over Orkney got involved in what was the Scapa 100 Celebration is the wrong word, although that would be the word I think a diver would choose. They'd be celebrate the fact that these wrecks are there, but we chose that it should be a commemoration. Because there are German sailors that did die while the ships were in Orkney. They didn't go down on the ships, but when they were scuttled, but they died. So it was great to learn the stories of the sailors that escaped or were trying to steal sheep off Carver, or stories of things that happened as the ships were brought over, of mutinous roller skating German sailors not wanting to listen to commanding officers while the ships were here. Even down to the very last man that was shot, the very last German sailor that was shot in Scapa Flow, and then his headstone was wrong for nearly 100 years. I should explain that. During the scuttling, certain sailors, or several sailors, were shot dead by the British, trying to get them to get back on the ships and stop them from sinking. And all but one of their bodies was recovered. One was unfortunately never recovered, and they're buried at Lyoness Naval Cemetery on Hoy. The very last man to die was a 19-year-old boy called Kuno Eversberg, but he wasn't shot on the 21st of June. He was shot on the 24th of June, already a prisoner on board one of the British ships, HMS Resolution. And he didn't die until the 29th of June of peritonitis. But to make things nice and neat and tidy, his headstone at Lyoness said the 21st of June for nearly 100 years. And it was a local wreck researcher, Kevin Heath, who I'm sure you are well aware of, that did the work to find his official death certificate, and the War Graves Commission changed his headstone for the Scapa 100 commemoration. So being involved in sharing that information and correcting some of those mistakes that should not have been made, it's just fun. It's fantastic. It really adds to the story.
And do you find, in fact, that some of the people coming to Orkney to dive in the flow, to hear about the story of the ships, are people with a family connection?
No, not very often. And we get surprisingly few German divers that visit, which I've always thought was quite interesting. You have more people connected to the Orkney story of the German fleet. So by that, I mean, you have the historical the history up and to the sinking, why the war history of the ships, and then you have what Orkney did with them afterwards. So the Orkney story, I think, happens from the date of the scuttling, and then moving forwards through the salvage years, all of a sudden we have this huge wealth of opportunity at the bottom of Scapa Flow, and that financial opportunity helped sustain Orkney through some pretty tough economical times in the early 20th century. So there are people more connected with that salvage story, whether it's divers that worked for the salvage companies, so we've got Cox and Danks, and then Metal Industries, and then the Scapa Flow Scout Salvage Company, which was that we're moving on to, that's Nundy Marine Metals, and then Scapa Flow Salvage, which were the blast salvage years. So there are people more connected with that story and the removal of either the ships or the blast salvage, which is what is connected with the ships we still have left. But no, not people that actually had relatives that were on the ships. I don't think there's that much information about those roll lists of those names that survived. I've never seen any of who were the sailors still left on the ships that when they were here. There might be somewhere, but it's not somewhere easy to find.
Yes, and in fact, you mentioned the remarkable economic impact of the salvage operation in Orkney in a fairly bleak economic time in the 20s. So are there stories of the kind of work that was involved and the particular techniques of raising the ships? Yes.
So you can divide the salvage of the German fleet into two chunks: ship removal and then blast salvage. So the ship removal is self-explanatory. The idea was to take an entire ship off the seabed and then chop it up for scrap, get rid of every single part of it. And that began in the early 20s. And it was a Stromness company that took the first ship. It wasn't Ernest Cox, and then a Shetland-based company that then removed 4 of the smaller ones. But it's Ernest Cox that earned the reputation as a man who raised a navy, and he salvaged 32 ships between the late 20s and in the 1930s, and he developed the techniques to do it. And with the smaller ships, he bought a floating dry dock. He cut it in half. So he then got 2 floating halves strapped together on the surface, but then with basically a middle that goes straight down to the seabed. And from one half, divers could take wires and chains, they worked out which ones were best, down to the ship, get them underneath the ship, and then back up to the other side of the floating dry dock. And then you can winch that to the surface. And we'll be able to see there's moving imagery of that. There's film footage of that process, and the huge hand winches. And these workmen had to basically jack a ship to the surface. And they were really clever at it, apparently. They could even turn a ship the right way up during the lift if they needed to. That worked very well for the smaller ships. For the bigger ships, they had to have very different techniques. And that was using airlocks or caissons. Again, we can see imagery of that. And these huge airlocks were constructed and then lowered down 30 meters, 20 meters to the upturned hull of the big battleships, fixed in place by divers and then held up with wires like a mast would be held up, or like a tent would be held up with guy ropes. And then just the top of this huge tube would stick out of the surface. Now, the workmen would then row to work, climb up the outside ladder, and then climb down the inside through all these airlocks and into the ship. They're not divers then working inside the ship. We've created this air bubble, air pocket inside the ships below the surface, where they can then work to compartmentalize the ships and seal things up so that they can fill the ships with air in a controlled manner and raise them to the surface that way. And we have lots of details about how that was done from a set of journals written by Thomas Mackenzie. Now, he was the main salvage officer for Cox and Danks and Metal Industries. And his grandson is a man called Ian Taylor, who has shared all of that information. It's even housed, those journals are now housed in the Orkney Library and Archive. So anybody can read those if they want to know more of those stories. And the stories are, some of the stories, these tales of what they got up to are fantastic. So that's how they removed the ships. By the time blast salvage starts, we've only got 8 left from 50 that was successfully sunk. So the huge removal of shipping. And I think it just became less economically viable to raise a ship to the surface and have to deal with the whole thing. And diving techniques had moved on to the point that we could blast and take the specific metals that we were looking for. So Nundy Marine Metals do far more of this. And then when they sold out to a man called Dougal Campbell, who was here in the 1970s, and it's Dougal we got to know really, really well. He passed away, unfortunately, in 2018. But some of the images we can show now of that blast salvage are his imagery, which is great to be able to show people. But they would send divers down. They would target the areas of the ship that they wanted. And this was for non-ferrous metal, which was prevalent in the engine rooms and the torpedo tubes. So there's different areas of each ship where they would be able to find bronze and copper and brass. And then thick armor plate, which is steel, but it's so thick and it was sunk, it was manufactured, more importantly, and then sunk pre-atmospheric nuclear testing. Which means that the level of background radiation in that steel is so minimal that once we had the salvage techniques to be able to get it off the seabed, it had a high value. So that's what they were going for. And of course, propellers and those sorts of things would also have a high value. So they would send a diver down. That diver would lay the charges, and then he would bring the detonating wire back up to the surface. And the diver that lay the charges, Dougal would tell me, would be the diver that set off the detonation. And that would be done from a small rowing boat where they would just row away from being directly over the wreck and then set off the charge, while the main salvage vessel would stand a safer way back. And we have an image of that we can show people, of a detonation going off. Every now and again they got it wrong, wind against tide. Dougal once set off the detonation while his rowing boat had drifted back over the wreck. And he told the story of the boat ending up at the top of the explosion. Him and his poor Labrador then ended splayed back in the bottom of the boat. The dog lost most of his hearing. Dougal lost most of his hearing. And then the dog thought this was wonderful because all the dead fish landed in the boat. So yeah, we have great stories, but then once they'd opened up the ships with an explosion, they could remove the items they wanted to the surface with a big crane or a big lifting, a big winch on the front of their lifting vessel, and then they'd just sell those specific metals. That was a lot of talking, wasn't it? What it means, though, is the German fleet we have left bear the scars of that blast salvage. It makes them harder to understand. It's helped, I would say, accelerate the deterioration, but it's also opened them up. So you see things that you would not see if they were just completely encased in steel. You'd just be able to swim around the outside or not be able to see any of the internal workings. So I think the salvage industry of the German fleet is an important part of the story, and it's one we need to embrace.
No, that was the question that I was going to come to ask you next, indeed, because with the salvage having taken away so much of the original ships, what actually is there to see nowadays that attracts people so much?
Okay, the salvage hasn't taken away even there's only a fraction of the material that's been removed. So the ships we have left, you essentially have the entire intact shipwreck. And we have eight ships, one small destroyer that is rammed up a beach, and so that's very, very broken. Of the more intact ones, we have 3 battleships. They're all the same sister ship, and we can see images of those. They're all 175 meters long, and they're so heavy with big gun turrets that they've turned upside down as they've sunk. Now they're not completely upside down; they're propped up. One at about 40 degrees and slightly further over. So you've got a side where you can get underneath the deck area, and you've got more visible, and a side that's then more buried in the silt. And then we have 3 light cruisers. These are about 150 meters long, and a fast mine layer that are on their either port or their starboard side. So of course you can see all the deck structure there. And they've only removed non-ferrous metal from engine rooms. There are no propellers on the ships, and then blast damage for torpedo tubes. So there's holes into the ships, but the ships haven't been removed. And then wherever there is an area of blast damage, it's an entrance into the ship, or they've left material behind. You can see a collection of multi-beam images. Now these are done remotely from a surface vessel towing a multi-beam sonar, and it gives us a whole bathymetrically accurate overview of what's left of the ships. So we can see all 7 of the main ships and what we've got left, and you'll also see the blast holes into them. In those engine rooms, there is still material left. There are turbines left on the ships. All the high pressure turbines, are still on the battleships. We've got a low pressure turbine still in one of the battleships, and it's enormous. We can show an image of a picture of that turbine with me next to it. And you can just see how huge that turbine is. And so we were able to see naval architecture in the form of the main ships, bow sections, stern sections, rudders. We can see the firepower. Lots of the guns are still visible on the ships, and they are warships. The engineering of the guns that are on there is fascinating. And then you get these blast holes and openings up into the ship, where you see the remains of what was left from what they've salvaged. For instance, wherever they've taken a torpedo tube. Now, a torpedo tube is a valuable salvage prize because it's made of cast bronze. Absolutely enormous things. And the ships had, some of the ships had submerged torpedo tubes, which they're inside the ship. That's why we'd have holes to blow into those. And some of them had deck-mounted torpedo tubes. And we have one left on the German fleet. Dougal missed one. He's got all the rest of them, but we have one left on the outside of the comb, which is enormous. And again, we can show an image of that to give you an idea of why it was such a valuable salvage prize. But wherever they've left, wherever they've removed a torpedo tube, what we have now is what was used to fire it, or the trolleys that would have been used to transport that torpedo to the back of the tube. The tubes were fired by compressed air, so there's just massive air banks of big cylinders, much taller than me, banks of gas cylinders in every single blast hole. So it just helps you understand even how they operated the ships. So yeah, for me, you can see I just get a little overexcited. it's a bit nerdy, but for me, the salvage damage has made the ships more interesting, not less interesting.
And you mentioned about imaging and scanning, some ways in which that they can be pictured so that up here on the surface we can see them better. So you've been using a range of modern techniques of imaging the ships.
Yes, so we can use the archive photographs, and the Orkney Library and Archive is one of the best resources for pictures of the ships here. And you can see what they look like when they floated, which is really, really useful. Then we have this collection of multi-beam images of the German fleet that were done by a team called ADAS, which was a collaboration between St Andrews University and the University of Dundee. That data was collected back in 2006, but there are changes, and it helps us map those changes. But they're a great baseline for the ships as they are. Then we've got underwater photographs, which really help capture a moment. They help you see the colours, they help you see the scale, and we can be very precise with what we're trying to capture. So they're really important. And then a newer technique is using 3D photogrammetry, which is everywhere at the moment. We're getting 3D photogrammetry models of land-based architectural sites like the Ness of Brodgar or the Broch of Gurness. To do it underwater is slightly more involved, obviously, but it essentially uses thousands of still images and a very clever computer package to then build up a 3D model of parts of the ships. Now, you could capture the data to do an entire ship this size in 3D photogrammetry, but you'd need, at the moment, a supercomputer to process that data. So what we've been doing, well, I say we, this is the 3D part of the team, which again, Newcastle University and Dundee University now. So fantastic people from there. We're gathering photogrammetry data, and then we're overlaying that photogrammetry data onto the multi-beam of the German fleet, just because we can't possibly process the entire ship in one go. And that technique has been incredibly useful to help highlight the points of interest. So we can see on the screen a multi-beam image of the Dresden, and it's bathymetrically accurate, but it's hard to understand. I think to someone who's not used to seeing that imagery, it looks a bit more like an ultrasound. Yes, you can see it ship-shaped, but you couldn't really see the detail. The photogrammetry then really gives you the detail. So we can overlay the stern of the Dresden here, and we can see the anchor at the stern. We can see the sternmost gun. We can even see the anchor capstan, and we'll be able to get everybody else will be able to see that. Another set of images is the Kronprinz, and this is the spotting top of the mast. Now, the mast on the Kronprinz Wilhelm, one of the battleships, was enormous. It's a huge structure, so big that the sailors climbed up the inside of the mast to get to the spotting top, not up a small outside ladder. And that now sits at a 90 degrees, snapped out on the seabed as the ship's turned over when she's sunk. So we have a photogrammetry model of the mast overlaid onto the multi-beam image, which really lets you be able to see something much bigger that you would never be able to see just in one go with your eyes underwater. And then we can then hone in with another level of detail and show a still image of me inside that spotting top, just to get you to understand just how big it is. And I think the combination of that archive images, multi-beam images, photogrammetry, and then still photography paints the best picture for either a diver to understand what they're seeing themselves, or for a non-diver to really understand what we've got under there. I think we've developed those techniques. We're applying them now to the German fleet, but we developed them more importantly to demonstrate what we've got left underwater on the British war graves, which I know we're going to talk about, just because we had a limited time and we needed to find how do we document this as accurately as possible. But yeah, that's we're coming on to that, I think.
That very much so. And it's so interesting that in addition to these remarkable ships from the German High Seas Fleet, there are also the remains of 3 British battleships either in the waters of the flow, or as in the case of HMS Hampshire, out with it and off the cliffs of Marwick. And I wondered, how did these big projects that you were involved in develop, surveying the Hampshire, the Vanguard, and then from World War II, the Royal Oak?
Okay, so there are other war wrecks. I just say in Orkney waters where people have died, but the Hampshire, the Vanguard, and the Royal Oak have the biggest loss of life. So those were the three we were really interested in. And the Hampshire isn't a battleship. We have the Royal Oak and the Vanguard as World War I battleships. Vanguard was lost in World War I. Royal Oak was still in service in World War II. And HMS Hampshire is an armoured cruiser, so she's a little smaller, a good 10,000-15,000 tons lighter, but yes, still an important World War I ship. So for someone that didn't grow up in Orkney, so I didn't grow up and didn't grow up remotely interested in war history. Those three ships were something that were just a bit of a mystery once I was here, and you knew where they were, and you learned a little bit about the loss of life, but they were just ships that you weren't allowed to dive. So you were very curious about them. So my interest initially was, I wonder what those shipwrecks looked like underwater. And then back in 2014, you were starting to be aware that I think the world was starting to be aware that we're coming up to the centenaries of all the World War I big anniversaries. And I just thought, I wonder whether you could get on the Hampshire ahead of her centenary to be able to share imagery. So the idea was born. I brought a few other people on board, and we applied for a license from the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, and we were successful. Now, the Hampshire is challenging because of where she is. So she's out with the flow, as you said, off Marwick Head, very weather dependent and much, much deeper than average recreational diving would go. The top of us about 55 to 58 and the seabed's 65 to 68 meters. So that was the challenge. It was putting a team together that could do that type of diving and do it safely. And we chose to have to do that in the summer months, because the likelihood of getting a run of days in winter out there was very slim. So we only had 2 weeks on Hampshire, but we put a team of people together to try and document as much as we could in those depths. We got a team of 13 divers, got 8 35, 40-minute dives on the Hampshire. It's not a lot to document a ship that size. We learned a huge amount about how to put this sort of project together. We shared lots of imagery, and it was just fantastic. And the team of 3D image people started to learn to work together to pioneer the techniques of doing deep shipwreck photogrammetry documentation. So it all started up here. It was fantastic. But then I spend my days in Scapa Flow looking around. You can see Flotter Oil Terminal. You know the Vanguard's down there, and she was the real mystery. Hampshire's story is very well known in Orkney, as is the Royal Oak story, because they were huge, significant war losses. With Lord Kitchener going down on the Hampshire, it's a famous story. Lots of people know about those. Not very many people knew about Vanguard. And more men died on Vanguard than died on the Hampshire or on the Royal Oak. 737 men died on the Hampshire, 843 died on Vanguard, and 835 died on the Royal Oak. So it's the biggest loss of life in Orkney waters ever. And her story was just unknown. It would be unfair to say nobody cared, but it didn't seem like anybody cared. And you wondered whether it was never as sensational a story because it was an accidental loss, not an enemy attack. So her centenary was the 9th of July in 2017. She'd been underwater 100 years. And so again, we'd been successful with permission to dive on the Hampshire. And I thought, let's see if we can take this on and do the next one. But I asked for a lot more time. So Vanguard, we surveyed over the winter of 2016, 2017. We wanted the imagery to be available ahead of the centenary so it could be really widely shared to really help raise the profile of that ship. So we spent about 500 hours on Vanguard across the team over that winter. And we needed every single minute. She's like a massive underwater Krypton factor puzzle. So for those that don't know the story, HMS Vanguard exploded accidentally on the night of the 9th of July 1917. It was an accidental cordite explosion which set off a sympathetic detonation of another cordite store on the ship. And when she blew up, the bow and the stern of the ship snapped and sank. The middle of the ship blew up. The bow and the stern have snapped off and sank pretty much where they are. They're about the length of the ship apart from each other, and they're intact. So we have an intact bow, we have an intact stern. The middle of the ship, everything above the waterline and above the armoured deck went up and out and predominantly towards Flotter. There is wreckage to the north, but the bigger chunks went out. So a huge explosion up into the air. And under the waterline and the armoured deck, the explosion has peeled the ship back on itself. So you have a battleship with big architectural features that are still intact, like an upright bow. She is the only upright battleship dreadnought battleship bow that I know of in existence. If you imagine that Titanic moment, it's there. An intact stern, and then an inside-out battleship spread out over 30,000 square meters. How do you document that? That's an even bigger challenge. So we started that with a different sonar technique called side scan sonar, and that was done by the team at Sula Diving to map the whole area, which gives you lumps of wreckage and GPS points for that wreckage. We can see an image of how spread out Vanguard is. And then we started diving it. We dived the main wreck. We divided her into sections. We lay a line from bow to stern, and that was our datum line. And everything we found was measured off that datum line to work out where it should have been to where it ended up. And it was the biggest challenge of my life. And it was so worthwhile to piece this ship back together. And you would think for something that was that devastating, that it's such devastation, you would think it would feel like quite a violent place to be. And it doesn't. It's an incredibly peaceful place to be. All three of the war graves are. They're full of marine life. They're full of artifacts that you don't see on the ships that divers have been allowed to salvage for so many years. It's a time capsule of an era of shipping that doesn't exist. And I just thought it was really important to share that imagery. So that was Vanguard, huge. And then the Vanguard centenary, I think we got better during that period of years in Orkney. Hampshire was really well done, but the huge focus of the Hampshire centenary was doing the wall at Marwick Head and renovating Kitchener's memorial there, and not so much about the underwater ship itself. And I think we were worried as to how well that would be received. Should divers be allowed to document the ship and share that imagery? But it was the bit that we did was very well received by relatives. Vanguard even more so. And so for the Vanguard centenary, we shared imagery. We had an exhibition, and we put talks on. And the relatives have loved seeing those pictures, and we got relatives during the centenary commemorative events that were put on by the council and the Royal Navy coming up to us and saying, my relative was a stoker, where would he have been on the ship? And to be able to get the ship's plans out and say, this is where he was and this is where he is now, was incredibly valuable. And our survey sparked off a project by one of the relatives, whose name is Wendy Sadler, for the Vanguard Crew Photos Project. And she's been gathering images or signatures or stories of all the lost crew. And she's got over 300 photographs now of men that were died on Vanguard, which is incredible given how long ago it was. And so for that human story to be being told, it just feels like we've been part of something much bigger than ourselves. So that was Vanguard. And then Royal Oak, well, it's quite a while to the centenary of the Royal Oak sinking. I'm hoping I'm still diving, but we thought maybe we should try and tell that story a little sooner. So we chose the 80th anniversary for that. And that, again, even a very different project. The Royal Oak is huge, absolutely enormous, one of the biggest battleships to come out of the First World War. And she's nearly completely intact. She has not been salvaged, save the removal of her anchors and her propellers, whereas Hampshire has had some illegal salvage damage, and Vanguard's blown up. So the Royal Oak must be the most intact dreadnought battleship underwater today. She must be. And so it's a very different challenge to document her but she's much shallower. So the top of her is only in 4.5 meters. So you get lots more time on her, but she's a more weather dependent spot over at Scapa. But yeah, it was an enormous task in poor visibility to document the ship. But that's what we did. So we have lots of photogrammetry of her. You can take she's propped up at about 45 degrees. So you have all the guns. And if you've ever been to the Imperial War Museum and seen the 2 giant gun barrels outside there, those are the size of the guns that are on the Royal Oak. Only topped by the Bayern gun turrets. They're nearly the biggest guns in Scapa. You can see all of those. You can see all of the bridge material. You can see the casemate guns down the side. That side of the ship is just, it's a treasure trove of artifacts and superstructure, and just so architecturally important. And then because it's not dived, you've then got crockery, and there are small holes into the ship that you can see plates still in plate racks, and musical instruments, and the decay in the side of the ship where the sick bay was. Medicine bottles have fallen out and are on the seabed, and you can look through portholes and see telephones or bed frames, and there's so many personal artifacts or then just structures that pertain to life on board, like crockery and things like that really help you understand how much of a human story there is to tell on a ship that was lost with her crew on board. It really does make it feel very, very personal. The other side of the Royal Oak, all 3 of the war graves surveys, was to add detail and information into the explosions that sunk the ships. So while I've talked quite a lot already about the team to document the imagery of the ships, I haven't talked about the munitions experts that we brought on board. So we have a gun expert and an expert in explosive effects, whose job was to give an account of the damage, and how and what actually caused the loss of the ship, so we can be relatively sure that we can pinpoint which bit of the Hampshire the mine hit, where on the ship that mine explosion took place to cause her loss. And then with Vanguard, we have a whole explosive effects analysis of how and why the Vanguard is where she is now, which is and what detonation at what point caused that to happen. And then with the Royal Oak, yes, we've got an inaccurate, in-depth explanation of the guns that are still there, which is just geekily interesting to some, but also of the side of the Royal Oak where the torpedoes hit, which is the other side of the ship. We have an explosive effects analysis of those 4 huge torpedo holes, which again we can show the audience here. Just the sheer scale of the devastation of 4 torpedoes hitting the side of Royal Oak. The first one, she would have stayed afloat with the first one and probably with the second hit, but the third and fourth breached internal bulkheads and really caused the loss of the oil that came out of the ship, and it was game over at that point. So to have that expert knowledge with us is also, I think, it just adds another layer that me on my own couldn't do, but to bring a team together that we can really bring the fuller picture to the surface. That was the plan. And it's really hard not to get really emotionally involved in one of the war grave stories, because it is a privilege to be allowed access to those. And then a huge sense of responsibility is, well, that's how I felt anyway. I've been given this permission, which initially is, yes, I get to dive one of these secret wrecks, and then, oh my goodness, I've got to do this properly and really share the information. And so I think we'll be able to at some point give people links to the reports that we've written if anybody wants to see more of the pictures and see any of that information. It's all free to download, the reports for the 3 surveys. So there we go.
This was something that really comes through in the story, how important this work is to the families, to historians, to people in education, people interested in naval heritage. And I guess this must be something that's very important to you personally.
Yeah, from the inspiration to try and get permission to dive those protected wrecks, being curiosity, the inspiration was, I want to dive them. Very quickly, that's taken over by that sense of responsibility and that sense of privilege. And then you just buy into it. To swim around them isn't, how do you even describe it? They're absolutely fascinating. I talked to you about the artifacts you can see, but and they are really important and make it a very different experience to dive in the German fleet. You also feel a time pressure when you're on there, because yes, while I was given an entire winter, they're so big that we've been photographing the German fleet for nearly 20 years. We had one winter to get a baseline on the war grave. So you do feel that you've got to just go at it like a bull in a china shop, just keep going every day there's weather. But then to swim, say for instance, if we take the Royal Oak, you swim down the side with the torpedo holes. They're violent. That hits home as to what those poor sailors went through on that night. To then see things like a porthole where you look inside and you see a bed frame. Now, we know the Royal Oak was lost in the middle of the night. So I might be looking through a porthole into an officer's cabin where I can see the remains of a bed frame, but I'm probably looking at somebody's grave. There was probably an officer in that bed that night. And those moments really hit home. And then the thing that all three war graves are littered with is this, scattered is maybe a better word, but it's shoe soles. They're everywhere. And on Vanguard, they're hundreds of meters out off the wreck. When we were diving, a lump of wreckage that's been blown so far off the main wreck site that we've dropped a line on that lump, and then we've swum back into the wreck to find the ship and see what you covered on the seabed. You find shoe soles everywhere. They're the thick part of the leather that's still survived. But of course, especially on the Royal Oak, those shoe soles are exactly where a sailor died. They haven't wafted out of the wreck. That is that sailor's grave. And that's that. It's like seeing the soles of the men. They're their shoe soles, but it is the soles of, I've said that before in other talks, but it's like seeing the actual sailor's soul on the seabed. And that really lets you know that you are very lucky to be visiting their grave. And you need to share this imagery as properly and sensitively and freely. So hopefully what we've achieved is a baseline survey, and by sharing that imagery, if I don't get to go back in my diving career, the next time somebody else does, they don't have to redo. They've got they can see what's changed rather than having to start from scratch again. And then to have that to help add to the commemorative events, that's we could talk about that now. That was really, really valuable to be able to share all of that.
And these ships and their stories indeed have been so much part of naval heritage. So the commemoration of each of those ships would be something very special that would generate a lot of interest.
Yes. So we're very lucky in Orkney that Orkney has a very close relationship with the Royal Navy Northern Diving Group that are based at Faslane. They come up, well, other than 1 year in COVID, they come up every year and change a white ensign on the Royal Oak. So that tradition is well established. They've been doing it since the 1980s. For Vanguard doesn't get quite the same treatment, but for her centenary, the Royal Navy got involved. So we'd finished our survey over that winter ahead of the anniversary in the July. And then the Northern Diving Group got in touch to say, we'd like to recover an ensign that had been placed on the Vanguard just as a one-off in 2009. And we'd taken pictures of that ensign. We found it. We didn't know it was there. Found it during the survey, and we published those pictures. They wanted to come and recover that ensign, which is now at Flotter, for people that want to see it, and fly a white ensign on the ship for the centenary. So we were invited back to help them do that. One, to take them to where on this huge site this ensign was, and then I offered at that point, I said, well, can we document your ceremonial work? Can we bring the photography team in the water and take pictures of you recovering an ensign and then flying a white ensign? And they said yes, which was great. So it started a new working relationship between our civilian dive team and this Royal Navy dive team, where we worked together on Vanguard. And then they were very much part of the project for Royal Oak. We dived with them for 2 years to document the work they do and how serious they take that. And it's very, very different to the diving we would do. So it was great to be in the water with them and see them recover an ensign. And some of the pictures are great to see this ensign flying underwater. And then they would recover one that's presented, in the case of the Royal Oak, to maybe a family member of somebody lost or an important. They choose that each year. And then they fly a white ensign for a few days while they're here in Orkney. When I say fly a white ensign, they attach the flag to the ship, and then they put a float on the top of it. So underwater it flies, if that makes sense. And then they stow that, they roll that up and stow it on the ship for a year, and then to recover it the following year. So we spent, as we had access to the ship, the Royal Oak, for several weeks over the course of 1819, we documented the whole year of a flag, from it being flown underwater, brand spanking new, and then stowed. And then each time we visited over the months leading up to 2019 and the 80th anniversary, we documented all the growth and the crabs that made it its home, and the anemones that walked on, and the silt build-up. And then, it was fantastic to be part of that. For both, for all three, for Hampshire, Vanguard, and Royal Oak, there was an on-water presence, but with Hampshire, it was one warship. The ceremonial events were on land and organised mostly with the council and the Kitchener Memorial team. But we had HMS Duncan on site a mile and a half off the coast, and they fired their guns for that centenary. For Vanguard and Royal Oak, we had a much bigger presence on the water, with service held on the water and wreaths put in the sea. And for Royal Oak, the community really embraced not putting plastic in the sea. So for the 80th anniversary of the Royal Oak, instead, we raised money to fund putting a single flower in the water for every single sailor. Well, actually, we initially thought for every sailor that was lost, but in the end, we put in one for every sailor that was on board. And so all the relatives put in all these carnations. They were scattered above the wreck. And there's a whole team of people, and there's some aerial photography of that you can see. And then the same happened for the centenary of the scuttling of the German fleet. There was a huge presence on the 21st of June 2019 for the centenary of that, an on-water presence, it was fantastic to be part of a fixed anniversary. None of us will be here for the 200th. So it just was a real privilege to be part of all of that.
And just one question indeed to look to the future. These ships have been so much a part of Orkney's heritage and the life of many Orcadians, the lives of the families and many visitors. How do you see the exploration and the study of these various ships developing in the future?
I think the German fleet will be a diving attraction way past my lifetime here. They are changing, they are deteriorating, but that's the natural evolution of any shipwreck. And unless we choose to make maritime safety no longer a priority, we're not going to replenish our stocks of shipwrecks. We don't sink nearly as many ships as we used to. So I think you can be sad about the deterioration, or you can embrace it. Now, the bonus to the warships we have in Orkney is they're so heavily built that, yes, while they're deteriorating far slower than a more modern ship would. We've got inches and inches of steel, not millimeters of steel in the case of the thickness of the hulls. So I think, for the German fleet, they will continue to be an attraction. And what I've found, and we can show examples of this, is as things change, new things are uncovered. So we have a case of the fast mine layer that we have, if as an example, the Brummer. She's very lightly built. She's quite a lot lighter than the next ship, so a good 1,000 tons lighter than one of the light cruisers, say. So underwater, that's taking its toll. And what used to be a whole deck inside, in the midship section, where we had this series of railway tracks on the deck, which looked like the wall because the ship's on her side. And these railway tracks, for want of a better word, they're actually mine-laying tracks, would travel all the way to the back of the boat, where they'd come outside at that point. They're inside further forwards. And you would transport a mine on its own little trolley on these tracks all the way to the stern, where you throw it in the sea. And they're on tracks so that in rough weather, you can't accidentally, drop one off the side of the ship. So you used to be able to see these tracks inside, and we can see an image of me inside there with the railway tracks. Now the entire deck has fallen off. And so what was inside is now outside. Now that makes those tracks far more accessible to divers. They not have to go inside a shipwreck to see them. And then what's happened just below that now, as that deckway's fallen away, is all the gas cylinders that were housed inside to fire the Brummer's deck-mounted torpedo tubes are now accessible. So as things decay, other things will be uncovered, which I think just adds to that interest. It means I need to keep going diving to see what's changed. With the warships, it would, I think, for understanding them and documenting their changes, it would be good to see them revisited periodically, so that more data can be gathered and we can see what's changed, see if there's anything else that can add to the story. But the decision as to whether they should ever be opened up for visiting divers is not mine to take. So that's a conversation to have with the MOD. But yes, to be able to share imagery and keep doing that, I think will be, well, it'll keep me interested anyway.
Emily, it's a fascinating story of ships and people and events and history, and the journey of exploration that has taken you from Home Firth to Scapa Flow. Thank you very much indeed for taking time to share the story and images with us, and we wish you many years ahead of fascinating exploration and adventure.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.